Reinventing Digital Inclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Karen Cho from CNBC, anchor of Squawk Box Europe, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here today. Well, to me, the future of the digital landscape is one of the most important conversations we can have this week in the context of the intelligent age. Technology promises to democratize access to just about everything, but it also threatens to drive a wedge through society for those who don't have access to the same connectivity or possess the skill set to navigate the digital world. Edison Alliance, since its launch in 2021, has been highlighting problems with the digital divide, driving awareness and supporting action. It has over 300 initiatives globally, but there are concerns that huge AI hype and investments will divert resources away from closing the digital divide. Now, I remind you to get involved with the panel. We're going to open this up for discussion on the back of some of the speakers, and also you can get involved on social using #WEF25. Well, let me introduce you to our speakers today. Joining us is Fatoumata Ba, founder and executive chair of Janngo Capital. We also have, joining us on stage, Strive Masiyiwa, who is founder and executive chairman, Cassava Technologies. And I'm pleased to introduce Robert F. Smith, founder, chairman, and chief executive officer, Vista Equity Partners. And you will notice there will be a late addition to the panel too. We're also waiting on the Honourable Paula Ingabire, who is the Minister of Innovation, Communication, Technology and Innovation of Rwanda. So if you see an extra panelist during the conversation, you know who it is. Well, Robert, please, let me start with you and the Edison Alliance, a community of 200 partners with an impact on 1 billion lives. I'll just repeat that, 1 billion lives. So you've managed to achieve change at scale, which is exactly what we're looking for here in Davos. What are the elements behind the success of this initiative, and how are those learnings over this Edison Alliance going to help us address the rest of the challenge with the digital divide?
Great, Karen, thank you. And I'm excited today to represent the Edison Alliance. It's interesting, when we had the challenge of the pandemic occur, we found ourselves wanting for connectivity in all societies. And as we determined what we needed to ensure that our businesses could function and we could actually, manage supply chains to deliver products, we realized that there's a huge gap. At that time, it was about, I think it was 3.6 billion people were not online and did not have access to broadband. And so the Edison Alliance was born of that. We had a wonderful group of founding champions. Paula was one, and she'll be here hopefully shortly. And Hans Vestberg, who was our chairman. We came up with a unique model, and it was a model of champions. And as a champion, what you would do is you would identify ways in which you, either the platforms that you managed, controlled, owned, or had influence over, could bring to bear the connectivity and the connectivity state to a set of people or a community. And then we shared knowledge and information and wherewithal. And I think what made it successful, and we are now 1.2 billion people, 15 months ahead of schedule, is because we had a forum to connect. And in this case, it was World Economic Forum, Edison Alliance, and we connected and shared best practices. And we shared wherewithal and resources and how you tapped into those resources. So those 200 partners were able to leverage each other that led to real activities that changed people's lives. There's a couple of examples I'll give you, one of which I think is actually there's a bunch of them quite exciting. In India in particular, they actually have a number of towers, power towers, cell phone towers, et cetera, that have space around them, which are the platforms on which they sit. And access to healthcare is always a challenge in most places. And so they started building, I'll call them kiosks, because they have power, they have connectivity or communications right there, so that people could actually go and use those to engage with the healthcare system. And it was used quite frequently by women who wouldn't necessarily want to go, and travel to the healthcare clinics. And so that became a very effective and useful way to use an underlying infrastructure to deliver healthcare into that environment. Another one in Saudi, which I'm quite excited to hear about, how they identified and enabled a number of the women who don't live in the main cities, who were artisans and building products, to not only sell those products, but find out where to price them and and make them available to other merchants. And the ability, and as I said, one of the things we did was we affected a lot of women in that context, so that was one of the goals and aims, but the ability to improve the condition of communities by accessing broadband, accessing technology, and then of course the applications, ultimately the things that created the utility associated with it. So we had very large global partners. We had folks like ourselves at Vista who are private equity firms engaged in various communities, and we were pretty excited the fact of meeting and exceeding our goal ahead of schedule.
So how do you kick that forward to 2025? How is that relevant today?
So I think that the relevancy in Strive and I and Will and others were talking about is, how do you now think about the new challenges? So there's still 2.5 billion people who aren't connected. And there's, folks, I know John Huntsman, I saw him earlier today, is working on part of that with MasterCard, et cetera. But what we're going to do is continue to make this an extensible program to try to get to the remaining 2.5 billion. And oh, by the way, we have a new challenge. This new kid on the block called Gen AI. And how do we enable communities access to compute, access to utilize their creativity, and in many cases also participate in the ecosystem that surrounds what Gen AI will be. So that's the next challenge, and the next challenge has been offered to the Edison Alliance.
That new kid on the block we're going to be talking about a lot during this conversation. But Strive, let me turn to you, because Cassava Technologies is a telecoms and technology leader. Now, you're a mentor as well. You're a philanthropist. You're sitting on boards like Netflix, Gates Foundation. I understand you're working on a new initiative in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. So can you just share with us a little bit more about that and some of these collaborative efforts that help try and close the digital divide?
No, thank you, and thank you so much for having me. And it's great to see so many friends in the audience. Look, what we are announcing today is really to build on the extraordinary work done by the Edison Alliance, and now take that to the next level, which is how do we ensure growth and prosperity in Africa using AI, the opportunities that will create. Because of course these are layers. Without the digital infrastructure, the connectivity, we can't move to that next level. So see this as a continuation, a sort of Edison 2.0, shall we say? But it's really to expand this collaboration now to bring in the new partners that are at the center of the early phase of the AI, and also to help create African partners. And to accelerate the entrepreneurial work that goes on in Africa, so that they not only benefit as users of AI, but also as entrepreneurs, building their own businesses, expanding existing businesses, creating jobs for young people, expanding education and other opportunities. So it's a great moment, and we are extremely grateful to the World Economic Forum for inviting us to be partners with them in this. This will be very much an African-led initiative, but with global partners. And we hope that some of our partners here will join us in this work.
How important is it that it's African-led, just on that point?
It's very important because Africans must develop Africa. It's our continent. So we are the ones charged with the responsibility to develop and we are responsible to our people. Our governments are elected by our people. We talk of elections. 500 million Africans went to elections this year. So we are led in an environment where we are responsible and accountable to our people. Therefore, we must lead the development of our continent.
If I could add just one point that Strive, which was, I think, a fundamental pillar of why we were successful in the Edison Alliance, it was each of the initiatives was led by the local people.
Correct.
So it wasn't here's what works here, let's dictate it there. It was here's what's work, you can use it or not, but local people actually drove the change that fit their particular need. And I think that's essential. And I think that's a key learning that has to be respected and frankly, honored as you move to 2.0. I think that's an important aspect of this.
I want to hear from Fatoumata as well, because your background is so interesting. A mentee of Strive, a first unicorn launched from Africa, and of course now we're talking about your role at Janngo Capital. You've been a huge champion of gender inclusion over the years. You've included leading Africa's largest gender equal tech fund. So just tell us from your perspective, as we talk about some of the barriers here, about advancing gender inclusion in the digital future. What can we think about how we collectively accelerate progress for women in particular?
Thank you, Karen. It's such an important question and a topic so close to my heart. When we look at the barriers that women are facing in Africa in terms of digital inclusion, I can share at least 3 of them. I would say the first one is really access. According to studies, roughly half of women still don't have access to broadband, and that's why the work of the Digital Alliance, for instance, is so important. As Karen mentioned, I co-founded Africa's first unicorn, which is the largest e-commerce platform, and across all countries where we're number 1, we always have 70% male shoppers and only 30% male shoppers. So the access issue is very critical. The second issue would be digital literacy. And here as well, when there is a will, there is a way. I remember, for instance, my first and largest seller of mobile phones in Côte d'Ivoire was a woman called Madame Diaby, who used to go to Dubai every 2 weeks or to China to get mobile phones. And I went and I was like, you can partner with me and I will get you on the Amazon of Africa, and you can use that to develop your business. And she was that, what is internet? Being a bit provocative. So we had to find a way, looping in a local, actually university, Polytechnique Houphouët-Boigny, to train young people to be the head of e-commerce for this type of sellers, and build capacity for them to be able to leapfrog as well their own businesses. But the elephant in the room, and the third topic, which is very, very important for me to tackle, is really the access to capital. I think in this very audience a few years back, McKinsey released a study called The Power of Parity, showing how bridging gender equality could unlock 26% extra GDP globally. In Africa, it's actually 10% extra GDP globally that we can unlock if we have more female entrepreneurs. And African women actually have the highest rate of female entrepreneurship globally at 26%. Yet, according to the African Development Bank, they are facing a $42 billion funding gap. And that's exactly why I decided, after our IPO, to really become an investor myself, pay it forward, and launch a venture capital fund, committing to invest at least 50% of our proceeds to startups co-founded and benefiting women. Now we're at Fund 2. It's today the largest gender equal tech fund, and Fund 1 has been extremely successful with 13x MOIC, when we're expected to return 3x the capital we were trusted with. And it showed that there is a business case for investing in women entrepreneurs.
Fatoumata, I have a question here, and I'm not sure it just applies to Africa. I'm going to pitch it to you, but it may be relevant for other countries as well. How do we cultivate more unicorns and digital entrepreneurship across the African continent? I think a lot of countries are thinking about that through their own lens.
You're very right. It's a global question. Actually, overall, globally, you have less than 2% of women that have access to VC funding, and even to loans. Last year, I was with Melinda Gates advocating for access to loan when the numbers were similar, 2 to 3% access to loan for female globally. And there is a strong paradox, because women-led companies are actually able to deliver, I think, around 63% more return for $1 invested than their male counterpart. To your question specifically about unicorn, I would like to share a few examples. So for instance, in Africa, you had roughly 11 companies that have been a unicorn at any point of time. And when you look at what they are doing, they are actually really serving the need of the people. So one, they're expanding access to essential services. It can be financial services. It can be products. If you take the example of Jumia, it's not because we were brilliant coders. It's because you have, in the US, one retail outlet for every 400 inhabitants, when in Africa, it's one for every 60,000 inhabitants. So people need and have the right to have the same access to quality products than everywhere else in the world. And when you look at Flutterwave, for instance, and many other African unicorns, they are in fintech. We have 600 million people that are unbanked in Africa, but we don't see it only as a challenge, we see it as an opportunity. Because at the same time, if you take a country like Kenya, you have more than half of the GDP going through mobile payments. Actually, 48% of the global mobile money activity globally is in Africa. So, and that's explained how you have so many unicorns. So beyond more access to capital overall, beyond female entrepreneurs, we need startups that are really leveraging technology to leapfrog development in terms of access to essential services, fintech, access to market for SMEs. It's super important as a backbone for our economies, and more importantly, access to jobs. I think Strive mentioned how we have this issue of job creation, which is really haunting us all. We create 3 million jobs per year in Africa when we need roughly 30 million net jobs to be able to absorb our demographic growth. And there will need to be more entrepreneurs creating jobs for themselves, but also for their peers.
I want to talk a little bit more about new technologies and what's coming. And of course, we're talking about convergence of technologies, your point around layers as well. 5G, something we've been talking about for a long time, the Internet of Things, big data, and of course now generative AI and how that threatens to change the landscape again. How do we think about these technologies and how they exacerbate the digital divide? Let me come to you first on that, Robert. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities here? Because something I heard this time last year was that, look, AI is fantastic. It's going to help countries with lower skill sets level up to more advanced nations. But here in 2025, I'm not as convinced about that story.
I think there can be some of that. The use cases, access and availability of compute, capabilities, education will all play into the rubric. I think what's occurring is, as you go through these S-curves of adoption of these general purpose technologies, of which Gen AI is one, it depends on where you stop. If you're focused on driving what I'll call kind of the foundational development, then that's, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars ultimately being plowed into that. But I think those who are actually focusing on the application of the current state will capture a vast majority of the productivity that this tool, this technology will yield. And depending upon the current state of your economy and the current state of the business and the infrastructure, you hopefully can, I'll call it, outrun in some respects the productivity that may come from other countries that might eliminate the need for, certain job classes to exist in your country. So I think the politicians in all countries will have a unique set of challenges here in the next few years. And the reason I say that is this general purpose technology is massively productive. Our companies, we live in the world of the enterprise. So this is business to business software. It's not consumers, business to business. So this is highly essential software. We own now 89 companies. And we measure what is the productivity of the products that our companies sell to their customers every year. It's still over 600% in what I'll call a non-Gen AI enabled environment. Gen AI actually creates exponential returns relative to that. So I like to say if you're a small business, your next best purchase is, or any business, buying more software. Small businesses, the ROI is closer to 900%. So you take an entrepreneur and all of a sudden you put a billing system in, a scheduling system. All those sorts of things change the dynamic of utilization of capital and resources that improve your ability to access your customers. When you start adding agents, Gen AI agents, to your workforce that don't sleep, and depends upon how you use them in the business environment. If you're using them for personal, you use them episodically. But in essence, if you actually embed them in Gen AI, in enterprise systems, they're on all the time. And so they create massive productivity that, the way I like to think about it, there are about 1 billion knowledge workers on the planet, and there's about $40 trillion in spend for those knowledge workers. All those become at risk in some way, shape, or form to Gen AI. In some cases,
They don't just get augmented?
It depends. Some will be augmented and enabling, and some there will be no reason for them to exist. And so that's the delicate balance that we will all face over these next 24, 36, 48 months as the infrastructure gets completed and that access to the compute becomes available. Then it's a cost question. What's the cost of the compute to utilize these agents versus what's the cost to keep a standard system in place utilizing people?
Strive, I know you want to come in, but I just want to welcome the Minister and introduce you again. Thank you so much for joining us, Minister Paula Ingabire. In fact, it was a conversation that we were on stage last year having about digital AI capabilities, and fast forward to 2025. What are you seeing? How is your government preparing for the intelligent age? And are you hopeful that AI may close the digital divide, or is that not really an optimistic scenario that's going to play out?
Thank you very much, and apologies, I was running late on another session where I was speaking. Am I confident? I think I just came from a session where we were discussing the potential for AI for small states, and one of the key conversations we're having was around the fact that if we're not careful, AI will exacerbate the digital divide. But I think it's also, we still have an opportunity to think through what does it mean if we truly want to be intentional and deliberate about closing the gap, thinking about how we democratize access to compute capacity, how we democratize access to the different training models that are out there, how we build the right human capital and capacity that is required to drive AI adoption across different African countries. And those are some of the things that are central to the national AI and policy and strategy that Rwanda has in really thinking about these building blocks that are so critical for us to be able to benefit from the promises that AI presents us, but also at the same time thinking about the risks. And when you think about risks, it's one of those areas where there's going to be a need for regional and global collaboration in thinking through how do we mitigate some of these risks, how do we put in place the right safeguards and guardrails, to really address these risks. And so for Rwanda, our focus is going to be on really, even for us as a public sector, identifying use cases that are going to transform public sector delivery. We want to be able to lead the way. We can't only, put on a hat of regulations and policy making. We also want to be able to experiment with the potential of AI across different fields of public sector. And that gives us an advantage point of making sure that when we set the regulations and policies, we are coming from a place of understanding how these are being used even in the public sector and how we can use these pieces of legislation to enable innovation within the private sector. And for these partnerships are going to be very crucial to get that done.
Minister, thank you. And Strive, let me just pivot back to you. I know you wanted to respond, but whether compute power is a sovereign issue, I think is fascinating from here. Who controls access? And we know already there's a couple of borders that have gone up around access to chips. So just weigh in.
Well, if I may, let me come back to the question you asked, Fatoumata, which is how do we develop Africa's unicorns? It's simple, the way others have done it. Mm-hmm. You see, we've got to, and I also want to speak here to African policymakers. You do not fund startups with debt. Mm. You provide equity capital, venture capital. There is no domestic venture capital. So where do these young people get the money to fund these businesses? We don't have a problem of entrepreneurship in Africa. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, more than in any developed country, because our kids leave school knowing that if you don't start something, you're not going to be employed. We have entrepreneurs, women. The challenge is simply we have not put in place an ecosystem to support startups. There's no concept of it. And until we tackle that, Minister, we will disadvantage our own young people. I have a platform where I interact with almost 6 million young African entrepreneurs. And if I go and I told them to listen to this show, and I can tell you they're listening. And I told them, and whenever I ask them, what is your challenge? They say, capital. Mm-hmm. We have no access. Mm-hmm. We can't borrow. Mm-hmm. We have no generational assets to go back to our parents to borrow from. Mm-hmm. So how are we supposed to fund these businesses? So the thing is, they start stuff because they can borrow a little bit here, and they go in circles. because there's no capital for them.
Strav, let me give you a targeted example. Large language models. France has got a great example of this. Mistral AI, created almost overnight thanks to a couple of rounds of funding, and then inked a deal with a massive American company, Microsoft, so it had further access to grow its business, but also access to a revenue model. Are you saying there's nothing like that exists in Africa?
There's nothing. You know, the Anthropics, all these young people in America that we're watching building companies, we have them in Africa too, except that there's no one's going to give them $500 million or $100 million. Our continent is receiving less FDI with 1.3 billion people than the wonderful island of Singapore with 4 million people. How are we supposed to develop with those kind? You know, we've got to solve this problem. We as African leaders have to come into the room and have a conversation with you as investors and say, what's missing here? Why can't we get this going? Okay, because we will still come back and talk about the same issues. So that's on the capital side. When it comes to the digital infrastructure that we need to do, you know, those of us who have had the opportunity to be able to at least break out of this, we've been building digital infrastructure. In preparation for the requirements of AI, we face similar challenges and bottlenecks as everybody else, compute in particular. But it's, look, given if AI is as important and as significant as we all say it is, and it is, then you have to respect the sovereignty of it. The compute for Africa will have to be in Africa. It's not negotiable. You know, this idea that we can do compute from elsewhere for Africa to benefit from, that's not going to work. We need access to chips just like everybody else. And we need to build compute for our educational infrastructure, for our government data systems, and that's just fact. So, but we're going to do it in collaboration with others. We need the investors to come in, we need to build the data centers, we need to build the power infrastructure. We're facing the same bottlenecks that this industry is creating, but perhaps on a more acute basis. But as an entrepreneur, I say, bring it on, it's opportunity for us. But it's just the way it's going to have to go.
Fatoumata, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think basically we are 17% of the global population in Africa, but we are only 2% of the FDA, but also 2% of the global VC funding. So there is funding, but there is not enough based on the scale and the speed that we need to be able to tackle on our issues. And also this little funding is very inequitably accessible. So I mentioned the gender gap, but you also have issues. For instance, you have like most countries that are raising money that are Anglophone countries. So 80% of the deals are concentrated in Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. When we say that tech is going to leapfrog development, it's even more needed in what we call fragile states. We also have a PE industry that is more mature than the VC. And as you know, the toughest thing about building a startup is starting up. You have a 70% death rate under year 3. That's a death valley, which means early stage funds are very, very important. And last but not least, if you are trying to raise money for fintech, it's easier. If you're trying to raise money for energy, it's easier. If you're trying to raise money for fashion or education or healthcare, it's very tough. You don't have thematic funds. I could not agree more. And maybe one last thing on this equation, because we've been talking about that in so many forums. So for FDIs, there is a risk perception that is very strong, that is not very equitable, because if you look at macros, for instance, India is raising between 8 and 20 more VC than Africa, but we have the same population, we have the same GDP, we actually have more internet users, more mobile phone users in Africa than India, in excess of hundreds of millions. And in terms of unlocking local capital, we really need pension fund asset owners to trust really the local VC, because there are assets. So for instance, if you look at how many percentage of the GDP, what's the share of the GDP from African pension funds, insurers, banks that are invested outside of Africa, it's actually 26% of the GDP. So we need to also create trust in that asset class locally as well as internationally.
I want to pick up on Strive's point around access to AI chips, and this may possibly be the first panel in Davos that has gotten through 20 minutes without mentioning Trump. So here we are. Several years back, Trump set the ball in motion for countries to rip out technology, cheaper Chinese technology that had been effectively in core networks. The Huawei story, and we were at the front and center of covering that. This had an impact even on cash-starved European telecommunications companies, let alone further beyond. Think fast forward to 2024, we had Biden also restricting access to AI chips. Now as we talk about Trump 2.0, Minister, let me ask you, could he get in the way of planning for a digital future?
I think yes. And again, I'm coming back to some of the comments that have been made around what is going to be the fastest and quickest way to democratizing this access. Again, the conversations are happening at multiple levels in different platforms, but my belief is that we haven't moved away from simply having these conversations and actually having action towards understanding that how much of this capacity can be made available for emerging economies and low middle income countries that really need this and want to be at the forefront of how we can adopt AI and with the much needed infrastructure that is required. And so what that leaves is a scenario or a situation where everyone is going to find a partner who is willing to provide that infrastructure. And so if you can find a partner that is going to enable you and give you that support, then you're definitely going to go with them. And then there's all this global dialogue and the geopolitics around it, which is definitely going to play very heavily around that. I've been around in platforms where conversations have been centered around how can the big countries have excess capacity that can be left out for the small countries? And I don't think that's the conversation we should be having. We shouldn't be talking about how much excess capacity does country X have to give country Y. It should be how do we make sure that every country, regardless of your capacity, your financial power, your economic power, how much access can you be, prioritization can you also be given so that you can also develop really at the same level. And so I think this is going to force for new partnerships to be forged, and obviously the geopolitics will play in, but this is something that is definitely worth looking out for.
Earlier we touched on digital literacy. I think that is a challenge of this age for many countries as we talk about augmenting, working with AI. What is your country doing over the last 12 months that really takes you forward to conquer some of those issues and digital skill sets?
So we've had a number of things, of programs that are running in terms of building digital literacy. And one of the things that we've done has been to, one, go into the education system all the way from primary school to tertiary levels and ensuring that we have digital literacy programs that are coming through. And the reality is that when we start to think about digital literacy training, we cannot unlock that without also thinking about device access. Because at the end of the day, how do people get trained on digital literacy? They need the digital tools to actually be trained. And so that's why there's been an active effort to drive both device access, whether it's a smartphone for citizens that are trying to access government services online, or even laptops and tablets for students in schools, so that at least we are driving both the agenda of digital access together with digital literacy. Now, again, the gap is big. I remember we've had conversations where we're looking at, for Rwanda, a population of 14 million people. We have a student population of about 3 million students. If you look at that sheer number and how much money is required to make sure that every student has a device in their hands, it's quite a big number. And if we then look at this from Nigeria perspective or Ethiopia or Kenya, then the number is even much bigger. So what we've been discussing with organizations like UNICEF is almost using the vaccine model, where you aggregate demand, you're able to talk to the companies that are manufacturing these devices, and you can lower the cost and then create device financing models around an even lower cost for these devices so that we can be able to do that. I want to come to one last thing, which was funding that both Strive spoke about, which, again, some of the challenges that we see and we face in, let's say, even I'll take an example for Rwanda, you meet venture capitalists who will tell you, we don't see investable companies. Then you meet the companies who are saying, we don't see the funds. So there's always, almost that conflict. And so we've had to ask ourselves, even as a government, where do we play to support, this synergy? Do we create, an early stage financing facility that provides grants and supports these startups to take up? In reality, we probably will not even have sufficient funds as a government to sort of support, but at least we need to start somewhere and sort of like create catalytic financing that can bring in more, partners that sort of think about the different growth stages of a startup and the kind of financing that is required to get there. And so it's a big challenge when we think about scale, but again, I think this is where I come back to the, the concept of partnerships in understanding what role does government play. How do we provide that catalytic financing and bring in the philanthropists, the big businesses in the economy that can sort of support this kind of innovation happening within the economy? And in reality, there's no one-size-fits-all on how this can be done, but I think for governments who always try to experiment with different models on how we can support startups.
Minister, thank you very much for that. And I have promised to take a question or two from the audience, and we do have a terrific audience. So we have a microphone around. If anyone would like to pitch a question, please stand up, put your hand up, and we'll bring the microphone to you. Got a couple of questions here down the front. So if you just want to, if you have a particular person to direct the question at, feel free to.
Hi everyone, I'm Luana Janngo from IDBR Brazil, based in Rio de Janeiro. And basically, I want to hear from you all your thoughts about how can we actually raise this digital literacy in countries from the Global South, especially in Brazil, but in aspect of why. Because, for instance, to provide motivation for professors or students or even employers in companies, we need actually to shift the cultures. In Brazil, there is a huge gap in terms of infrastructure, and we also need to actually motivate people, not only by the lack of infrastructure, but also through culture, so they cannot see AI as a fear, but also as a motivation to use it. So we develop an AI in Brazil to basically try to motivate people, but I want to hear your thoughts on how can we motivate more people to get into this.
Robert, do you want to tackle that?
Thank you.
Sure, and I want to also, I'd be remiss if I didn't hit a couple of points. One thing that's interesting, I agree that each country should have its own, in essence, sovereignty around the data set for its citizenry. The interesting thing is, for a lot of the use case applications, you don't need these, H100s, H200s to do that. It's a pretty simple set, often, of engagements with the government. Now, healthcare data is a whole different thing, but you don't need that. So it's actually doesn't necessarily fall into some of the constraints that are likely going to be imposed on what chips are available to whom. So there's a different model that has to be thought about and a different paradigm that has to be evaluated that says, how do you use a different set of solution sets within constrained environments that actually give you the same outputs and the same capability to lower cost and lower power and lower call it, total footprint. And I think that's the model that needs to be thought about for those sort of applications and use cases.
But is that coming? It's not there yet, is it?
No, it's there. We do it now. We do it today, every day in our businesses.
On AI solutions.
Oh, absolutely. And they don't use the utilization of, racks of H100 servers to manage a property and casualty insurance claim.
Why not? Lack of expertise in technology?
No, it just doesn't. No, I'm saying that the system does not require that level of power and inference state in order to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, you don't need to spend, hundreds of millions of dollars. Everyone thinks you do, but for certain use cases you do, but in certain use cases you don't. And managing data around, property data in a country or the use case in a country for, managing parking ticket, you don't need that. And so I think there needs to be rethought the model about what you actually need. Part of that actually feeds a little bit into your program is, how do you teach and train and develop? You don't have to teach and train and develop on the latest. Remember that S-curve I was talking about? You don't have to be, building out, large-scale foundational models to use inference state to solve unique problems for a community. And so I think there has to be you have to use it and you have to think about it and you have to engage in people who do this for a living to find use cases and solutions for your exact problem and then decide at what scale do you actually need to utilize current and existing Gen AI systems versus some, AGI systems later. So I think you now have to dissect this problem in the solution sets that fit the problem in order to solve some of the, call it the Edison 2.0 issues, right? And I think that's where we need to really focus our time as a group and say, okay, what do you actually need? And at what size and what scale to solve the problems for the citizenry of that country. And at some point, you're gonna want your citizenry to use it for fashion and design. That's a whole different creative state than solving, you know, a property and casualty insurance claim. I mean, there's defined states of output there that you don't need H100s for. So.
I want H100s.
You should get them.
And I want them now.
Yes.
And I'm going to roll them out in Africa. We're going to do it. We cannot have 1.3 billion people and others have the infrastructure. This particular infrastructure is non-negotiable. We're going to get it, and we're going to build it, and the entrepreneurs are there to do it, and I'm coming to Robert for the money. I just have to persuade him on the return. No, you know, I take on board much of what you say, Robert, but part of our own sense of dignity and sense of progress requires that we must lead with some of our own solutions. But, you know, to close off, what you talked about vaccines. Fatoumata and I was the African COVID czar. And I called out for young people to step forward and help me. And we particularly had a problem, which is how do we aggregate the few. We were in the market struggling to get access to vaccines, to PPE, all these things. And my young mentee here, she came and worked for me full time. And she built the platform. She put the team together that built the platform called the Africa Medical Supplies Platform that enabled Africa to deliver vaccines, therapeutics. We had the lowest death rate per capita of any region of the world. And she helped do it.
It's all strive, honestly. It's all strive.
Now, the problem with 45 minutes is it goes very, very quickly, and we are actually out of time, despite how wonderful this conversation is. And I would so love to take more questions, but I'm going to have to wrap up and say thank you very much to our panelists. We do appreciate your valuable contribution today. So thank you very much to Robert, to Minister, to Strive, and to Fatoumata. We do appreciate your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Strive. That's so kind of you. But it's all yours.
Tell the world.